Thank you very much. So we heard earlier from a honorable mention paper, so I just wanted to mention that our paper was also, it received almost honorable mention, so it was one of the 100% of the papers that got that award, so we were pretty happy about that. So I did this work. I'm Mark Hancock. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo, and I did this work with my postdoc, Deltcho Valtchanov, and so this is actually an extension of a lot of his PhD work, and he was the primary author on this. The main message that I want to get across in the talk today is that images of the environment can be analyzed to estimate the valence of the expected affective response. And more specifically, this analysis can be used to provide feedback about affective response. Now, I know it's getting late in the day, so if that's a little bit complex, it can be more simply stated, perhaps less precisely, as it is possible to estimate how pleasing it will feel to look at an image. So specifically what I mean by that, there's actually quite a bit of research already in HCI, as we all know, on affective computing. And Rosalind Picard kind of started this idea. But there was a lot of work on looking at images of people, for instance. And in these images of people, we can actually gather information about their valence by looking at feature extraction, this kind of idea. This sort of approach could be summarized by saying, essentially what's going on here is that the input is image data of a response of some kind that's then analyzed in some way, and with that we provide an emotional state of some kind. And this kind of information can then be used in systems that react to affect in some way. In our work, and actually other work has done something similar as well, we look at image data as the stimulus specifically, and then we analyze that stimulus instead and come up with a predicted or estimated expected response as output of that system. And so the idea here is we can take that kind of information and put it into systems that do things like recommend or suggest what you might want to do, or something that you might want to look at based on that desired affect. And so the idea here, for instance, you could have Google Maps data, and you could take all of the images that are available through Google Maps and provide recommendations about, for instance, if you're going on a run or a walk, what run would be pleasing to go on, or what walk would be pleasing to go on. So you see here in Waterloo, if you went down the Iron Horse Trail, it might be a more scenic route, and it would be more pleasing to go down that route rather than going down some street that has a lot of buildings, has a more cityscape-like environment. So this is just a mock-up, but we actually did create a prototype of a system that is able to do this in real time that called EnviroPulse. And the idea here is for your camera app, you can actually have it tell you in real time whether the thing you're about to take a picture of is going to be something that might be pleasing to look at later. So you can see here at the bottom, there's a bar that kind of gives an impression that what you're looking at right now is neutral, and it becomes more positive when you get a more naturalistic scene. And so you might be thinking, well, if we look at images, a lot of us look at images in different ways. So what about subjectivity? What if different people look at the same image and think something different? Well, it turns out that actually, if you look at the cognitive psychology, a lot of the affective reaction that we have to images has a reliable and detectable response in the human visual system. So if we look at that in more detail, essentially what's going on in the visual pathway is that we have in this V1 to V4 range, after we go through the visual cortex, we have essentially very low-level processing of images. We do things like look at the color and the texture of an image. Then when we go into the kind of lateral occipital area and the ventral occipitotemporal cortex, we then start to process that information in terms of surfaces, objects, places, and faces. And then when we look even further into the collateral sulcus, that turns then into buildings and houses and things like vistas. So that it maps that into an even higher level thing. And then in the parohippocampal cortex and the renal cortex, we actually look at that same information in the context of memories and interpret that data. So it turns out, throughout this whole thing, if you're in the front row, you can probably see that there's little black dots, and you can tell the people at the back later that actually there were little black dots there. But essentially, those are opioid receptors, and so this visual pathway has in it a direct relationship to the pleasure senses and the pain senses in our brain. And so it turns out we can actually figure out with an image processing technique the same kind of idea about an image, whether it will be pleasing to look at. So you might be thinking, and we are essentially doing this kind of same low-level processing, like is what is happening in V1 to V4. And so you might be thinking, no, really, what about subjectivity? People actually look at images in different ways, and so we actually might interpret this differently. Well, we're not actually the first people to try this kind of technique. There is a lot of video analysis techniques that look at, for instance, recommending, based on the content, what a person might feel in reaction to that. So for instance, Hancock et al. have actually looked at feature extraction of audiovisual signals, and they actually have processed this in terms of the circumplex model that the previous authors have been talking about, and then coming up with a model for what kind of emotional response you would have to an audiovisual signal. Zhang et al. Have taken this another step and looked at music videos, and included in that kind of a feedback loop of user preference. So by rating music videos as you go, you can actually put that as a feedback loop and provide better data, an individualized preference model for what's going on. Now, our work differs from this kind of idea specifically in the sense that we're not looking at things like feature extraction or machine learning techniques to process these images. We're actually looking at a much lower level at the cognitive psychology that determines what this kind of affective response is going to be. So how do we do that? Essentially, in the cognitive psychology, it turns out that images have specific shape, contour, complexity, and color that lead to these kinds of affects. So for instance, if you were to look at a nature-like scene, it has a type of spatial frequency and color spectrum that is processed very similarly in most people's brains that turns out to create positive affect. So that kind of brain signal is something we can detect. And similarly with city-like landscapes, it turns out that people react negatively to this kind of thing, and that's actually, again, interpretable from spatial frequency and color type methods. And so again, this is kind of processed directly in the brain in the same way, and we can actually use data to come up with our own curves and theory about how that works. So in order to come up with our model, we actually aggregated data over a variety of different studies. There's more than 7 past studies that we looked at, and people did things like rate photographs on different types of scales. So they did from like not pleasant to highly pleasant. And we normalized these scores across these different studies and came up with our own model for, based on these results for what this should be. And it turned out to look very quadratic. So this one was essentially an upside-down quadratic curve for shape, complexity, and contour. And so it's known, based on this past literature, that these peaks are the places where people will feel high valence experiences, and the other ends are low valence experiences. And so we came up with a content score that was just the average of these 3 things. And then we did a similar thing for color, where we had the wavelength along a quadratic curve as well. That was, again, coming from this literature. And then a color saturation as well did the same kind of idea. Now, there was an arousal value that also came from the color luminance, and it was, again, a quadratic curve with a little bit of a tail. When you get a really high luminance, it's actually approximately 50-50 what people will feel. It's a kind of a neutral arousal situation. And that led into a color score, which is really just the multiplication of those 2 things. And then to combine both the color score and the content score, we just did a weighted average. So it was 30% color and 70% content. And this was just based on trial and error, what worked well in our experiences. And so to evaluate the algorithm that we developed, we essentially took data from these known rated images and pointed our camera app at a projected image of the same thing and recorded the score that it had and compared it to what score people rated on a subjective scale. And it turned out that there was a lot of agreement. So essentially, people that rated things negatively, on average, our algorithm predicted the exact same thing. And so you can see here the agreement is when it's both rated negative, both rated neutral, or both rated positive. And we did a Cohen's Kappa to determine the agreement score between our algorithm and this and the average score. And there was a kappa of 0.5, which was significant, less than 0.001. And if we were to compare that to each individual and their ability to rate these images themselves, they had a kappa of 0.36. So we're doing a lot better than humans at predicting what people will experience. Even if you take the best human, the EnviroPulse algorithm was doing better than the best human. Not this much better, but close. And so we taking this algorithm, we actually then wanted to present back to the user what kind of affective score a particular image would have in real time. And so we created 4 different ways of visualizing that feedback. And they were very simple. So essentially we had 2 different categories of them. The first one was factual and the second one was affective. So using the cognitive psychology literature that we've been reading, we actually also created visualizations that induced the kind of affect that people would be experiencing. So now the first ones are being factual, we're simply just kind of like a bar graph where you have things to the right are more positive and things to the left are more negative. And we also dissected this into a multi-dimensional visualization, a glyph, where the 6 axes are actually spread out. So when you have a hexagonal fat shape, that's a more positive thing, and when it collapses down into a smaller shape, that's more negatively valenced. And then we had the 2 affective versions of this. So the way they worked is we had the first one was a wave, and it turns out from the cognitive psychology research that smooth waves that move slowly are experienced as more pleasing than things that are sharp and more quickly moving. And so that would be experienced something like this. If you were looking at a building typescape, it would be kind of a sharp, jagged red edge. And then if that it transfers between a neutral image and then a more positive image, it smooths out, moves a bit slower, and becomes a more sinusoidal wave. A second type of affective visualization that we created was called the pulsing amoeba. And essentially the idea here is that if it was pulsing slowly in green, that would likely induce a positive affect. And if it was kind of sharp-edged and red and pulsing quickly, it would be a negative affect. And so that would look something like this. Essentially, if you go from a nice scenic view, nature scene, it would look induce positive affect if you have this slow pulsing. That's quite smooth. And then if you move to something neutral where there's some buildings and some nature to something that's just kind of buildings and completely, a city landscape, that's more negative, and so it's sharp and fast moving and red. And so, as you might imagine, there are some limitations to this algorithm. And actually, it turns out that that's actually a good approach to thinking about what the next step should be, what the future work is. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that we could do with this, the next step, is to think about customizing this for individuals. So we actually provide some sort of profile system where you could rate images and say whether you agreed with the score, and then have that as feedback to the system itself. That's something we'd like to do in the future and see if we can get an even better agreement score. We'd also like to evaluate the effectiveness of the visual feedback that we talked about. Now, note that we actually did do some informal evaluation, but most of the responses were about the ease of use of the camera app rather than about the effectiveness of the visual feedback in communicating the affect score that we had. So we'd like to do a more formal study in the lab to really figure that out. We'd also like to explore alternative affective visualizations. We think it's a really neat idea to be able to induce this kind of affect through a visualization itself. And so we could represent not even just have affective data, but also any other kind of data and induce affect through it. So I think that's an interesting approach to attempt. But you might still be thinking, seriously though, what about subjectivity? People think different things when they look at images, so how could this possibly work? Well, actually our algorithm, I think what we've shown here is that it is effective for things like landscapes and scenery, but there are other types of images that it's not very good at judging, and that's things like faces, and things that have some sort of association for a person. So if you, for instance, are looking at a picture of food that you particularly don't like, it might actually have good spatial frequency and good color, but you still won't like the image. So this does happen, and as you may have remembered from the image of the brain that I showed earlier, there are later parts in that visual pathway that actually dictate what's going on there. But even earlier in that pathway, there are things that are happening at this low level still. But it might be worth iterating on this algorithm to try and improve it to be good at that too. And there are other exceptions as well. So for instance, there are people with something called agoraphobia, where there is a phobia of open spaces and outdoor type of events. And so that, like, when they look at a scene of kind of this nice open area, they might actually not have a positive reaction. So it does actually depend on the individual somewhat. But to a large extent, and probably a greater extent than you might realize, this is actually happening in the brains of most people when they look at images. So there is a good prediction that we could come up with just by looking at this cognitive psychology. And I just wanted to remind everyone that the main message I wanted to get across today is that images of the environment can actually be analyzed to estimate the valence of the expected affective response. And this analysis can then be used to provide feedback about affective response in things like our EnviroPulse camera app, or in things like Google Maps or something along those lines. So thank you very much. And I'd like to also remind you that this work was done primarily by Deltcho Valtchanov, who is my postdoc currently. And by the way, he's looking for faculty positions right now. So if anyone's looking for a particularly intelligent cognitive psychologist, he'd be a great person to look up. Thank you.
Hi, Steve Bristol, University of Glasgow. So, does it work for video?
I don't see why not. You just do the many frames of the video, and it works in real time already with that camera app. So yeah, I think it would.
Have you tried it, or
No.
that's
Well, I mean, unless you consider moving a camera around video, which it kind of is. So.
So are there, are there any differences? Do you think there would be any differences as it was doing that, or would the same visualizations work? You just morph between them somehow.
Well, so I think that the visualizations would help you know at that instant what that affective response would be, but actually there is a development over time in the brain as well that goes on, and you might actually have a memory later that's different from exact instances. So I think there's a lot of work that could be done there to really figure out whether or not that video analysis over time is actually a good profile or not. But I can't honestly answer without having done that research, but yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Espen Knoop, University of Bristol. So I'm just intrigued. So you said that your algorithm is better at predicting whether I'm going to like an image than another person is.
Right. So,
Wow.
and what I mean by that is it's not necessarily for an individual, right? So this was taken with the average data. So this was the agreement score between what a person predicted would be a positive versus negative response to an image versus the average for a bunch of people, right? So it's true that you probably for yourself can judge better. But what that means is that for the individuals in that study couldn't predict on average what people would do as well. Okay. Yeah.
Actually, I have a question.
Okay. Sure. Yeah.
So for one place, you mentioned in your future work that this work can be applied to the Mac service, and for one locations we can take multiple pictures. And do you find agreement between those pictures in terms of the expected valence?
Good question. So it actually, as you noticed probably when the camera was moving around, because it's things like spatial frequency, if you have, for instance, a beam that goes right in the middle of that image, that really changes it quickly. But if you're looking at a fairly consistent landscape, it tends to be quite consistent. So it depends kind of if the image changes abruptly or not, is the real answer. But you can, I think, provide, as we kind of mentioned, an aggregate over a bunch of images, whether or not that average is high, that's likely to be a place where if you run there, you're going to have a good time, essentially. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That summarizes our session.